Welcome to the Beer Ladies podcast with your hosts, Lisa, Katie, Christina, and myself, Tandy. You can find us at our website or all over social media. Our website is beerladiespodcast.com, and our social media, Twitter, Instagram, Mastodon, Blue Sky, TikTok, and even Facebook are at Beer Ladies Pod or Beer Ladies Podcast. If you'd like to support the show, you can find our merch store link on any of our social media bios or in the show notes for this episode. And if you'd like to sponsor an episode, do mail us at beerladiespodcast@gmail.com. Now back to the beer.
Hello, and welcome back to the Beer Ladies podcast. I am Lisa, and I am your host today, although I am joined by co-host Christina. Hello, Christina. And she's saying hello. She's saying hello. She's waving. But we are very excited because we are doing another one of our beer history interviews, and this one really crosses styles and history. We're very excited about this. But we are thrilled to welcome Lars Marius Garshol. Hopefully, I said it pretty well. So hello, Lars.
It was pretty well. Absolutely. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So thank you so much for joining us. And before we dive into today's topic, we want to do our sort of usual going around the horn and find out what people are drinking. And I know I'll start with you, Christina, because I know you're not on the sauce tonight, but
no. I'm sorry, you're all gonna have to bear with me. I have a bit of a cough, but I once again have my skull mug with my lovely berries tea. Yay!
We all love this skull mug. It's been on our socials. People have seen it. It's almost got its own fan club. So it's good to see it again. Wonderful. And Lars, how about yourself? What have you brought for us today?
Yeah, I'm drinking Farmhouse ale.
Oh gosh, and is that out of a wooden cup as well?
A wooden bowl, yeah.
A wooden bowl. Oh,
it's not. This one is not really traditional. It's too small and it's not painted. I only thought of that now. I have a real one in the next room.
Oh wow! Oh well, we can definitely put up some photos later if you've got some. So we'll definitely dive into that a bit more. Oh,
so this
that's
is
wonderful.
the beer. It's Cornell is the style. It's a raw ale with crack.
Oh,
and
wonderful!
Juniper, of course. Yeah.
And juniper, of course, yes, and it's got a beautiful can there too. We'll try to put some pictures up. It's a red can with some lovely gold lettering on it. So we will come back to that. And for myself, we don't really have a lot of Norwegian farmhouse ales here in Ireland. I know that's going to shock people. So I do have a Ballykilcavan Clancy's cans, number 12. It's their IPA. So obviously nothing at all related style-wise, but it is made there on the farm at Ballykilcavan. So I've done my best to get a little tie in there. So, and this is a lovely beer. I've had it quite a few times before. It's part of their sort of one-off series. And yeah, this one's a very nice IPA, 5.5%. And it's been a lovely one. So excited about that. So that's our usual formalities out of the way. So again, welcome, Lars. And I wonder if you could give us a quick introduction, and then we'll talk a little bit about maybe what you've been doing with beer history. But before we get into that, we want to know about you, and we want to know about Norwegian farmhouse ales, because I know there's a lot that can be said there. But we'll start with you. So tell us about yourself and how you got into beer history.
Okay, so I started as somebody who was just interested in beer, like tasting different beers, trying them out. I used Rate beer before Untapped was a thing.
Right.
Really explored the globe, all of the styles. And then I came across Norwegian Farmhouse Ale, which nobody really knew about. Like people who were knowledgeable had some idea that there was something there, but nobody really knew what it was. And I got super interested in trying to understand what it was, because it tasted so completely alien.
Right.
It didn't taste like modern beer at all. And it was really digging into that where I started seeing that, okay, so people are making it in this county and this other county on the opposite side of the country, they're also making it, but it's completely different. And then you have to try and work, okay, well, what is it? Where does it come from? And that sort of led me to understand that it was farmhouse ale, and that basically people made it all over the country originally, like literally everywhere.
Right.
I'm on the edge of Oslo, the local history museum here, which is really just a volunteer thing. But they have a farmhouse brewing vessel from 1840 standing there. So like anywhere you see a farm, they will have brewed. But so how did I become or get into history? So when I got interested in this, the starting point was the brewing that was happening now, because that was something that you could travel to see, you could understand what they were doing, you could taste the beer. But it was really trying to understand how does that fit into the larger beer world that forced me to go backwards.
Right.
Because you see people doing things that don't make any sense. They're completely different from what everyone else is doing. So you have to try and go backwards to try and see where does it branch off from the brewing that we know. It's kind of, and then I discovered that actually learning about, you know, brewing in Mesopotamia or whatever you like actually helped me understand it.
Oh, that's interesting.
But my you know, Brewers Publications published this book.
Oh,
Historical
wonderful.
Brewing Techniques,
I
The
have a
Lost
copy.
Art of
Wonderful.
Farmhouse Brewing. But the point of the book is that it's not lost and it's not historical. It's here now.
So it's a bit of a misnomer. Lots of myths to bust. On that.
2 misnomers in one title, so that's pretty good.
I know, Christina, I think that you're not at that level yet with your book coming out soon. But I know the struggle is always real to land on a title that everyone's happy with. So
yeah, long story.
Yes, it always is. And to dive in a little bit more to those different styles, and like you say, kind of everyone was making them, but it looks like there were a couple different, maybe sort of broad categories. Talking about the historical ones first, but what is that? Does that sort of mapping, if you like, still hold true, or I think are these categories sort of malleable, if you like?
Well, they were very malleable because you know, everyone brewed the way that they learned from their parents, maybe with a couple of modifications, and so on, you know, back into prehistory effectively. Right. So there was absolutely no standardization of any kind. But today, the brewing has been through sort of evolutionary bottlenecks where they were down to very few brewers, right?
Right.
So I wouldn't say it's standardized, but we have like 3 fairly clear styles.
Okay. That
are recognizable, and in the Western Norway and in Central Norway, and then in the East, there's people who brew stuff that's outside of those categories, but they are so few that it's, you know, if you have a single brewer, you can't really talk about the style.
Right. It's just what they make up that particular farm, or
yeah, pretty much. So yeah, that's kind of the state of things.
Oh gosh, that's interesting. And Christina, I don't know if you have a question to bring in here, but I think it's so interesting that, like you say, this is, you know, these are kind of the historical things, but they haven't gone away. They're still around. So I wonder if you could maybe speak to that a little bit, or I don't know if, Christina, if you want to delve into that a bit.
Yeah, I was just going to ask sort of how, you know, we introduced the book. If you could talk a little bit about how the book came about a little bit more.
Oh, great shout, yeah.
For our audience, if they're not familiar with the book, what it's about. I mean, we've kind of touched on that, but just a little bit more. Just a little bit more
on the book first. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, so the book is kind of my attempt to explain to people who know brewing, really know how to brew, what is farmhouse ale, what is it like, how is it made, what does it taste like, what are the different ways of making it, and why was it made the way that it was. Because if you don't know the background, a lot of the stuff that you read in here is going to be, haha, that's ridiculous, nobody would ever do that.
Right.
But if you get the context, then it makes a lot more sense, and it comes alive in a different way. So the book also tries to you know, it explains about these.
Wonderful.
It goes into, you know, what were the occasions that they brewed for, who was doing the brewing on the farm. So it tries to go into more of the background as well and try and set the scene a little bit. The way that it came about was, well, you know, I did all this research. I had to tell somebody. I started planning this book, and then Stan Hieronymus put me in touch with Christy Switzer, the editor at Brewers Publications. And when I sent her the kind of outline and beginning text that I had, she was like, "Nobody's ever heard of this stuff before. We're taking your book."
Oh, that's wonderful. I love that no one knows about it is a good thing, because I know sometimes it can be a bad thing depending on the the publisher, but that's wonderful to hear. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that struck her, as I recall, was I had a photo that I got from the Estonian National Museum of somebody who was not just brewing stone beer. They were sprinkling rye flour onto the stones before putting them in the mash.
Oh, interesting.
I've seen videos of that on
Yeah.
YouTube, and the rye flour catches fire. It looks
Yes,
like
I've
almost
seen
like you're
this.
pouring gasoline on the thing.
Yeah, we'll have to try to put some links in the show notes, because I remember seeing that as well. And I feel like there was a trend, and well, trend may be overstating it, but I feel like there was a moment maybe in kind of the mid to late 2000s where people, at least in North America, I don't know if it was the same in Europe, were sort of discovering, and I'm putting that in air quotes, things like sati and things that are sort of related, although maybe not quite the same. And I feel like there was a lot to do with throwing stones into hot water and seeing where that led. And I wonder how much of that is sort of meaningful, like in the case you described, versus kind of maybe a bit of showmanship. I don't know.
Well, stone brewing definitely was a farmhouse brewing technique.
Yeah.
It was used or I have evidence of it from pretty much all of the countries that I've studied.
That's great.
And you know, the Stein beer, the commercial style that was famous, that was also definitely a farmhouse ale. When you see the equipment, the ingredients, the malting equipment, it's straight out of my book almost. They were even using juniper in Stein beer.
Okay, we'll definitely come back to the juniper, because I think there's a lot of different directions to go with that. But yeah, but before we do that, I don't know, Christina, do you have any more book follow-up questions? Because you are allowed to have as many as you like. So
yeah, so that's your first book, and I think that's really interesting. But you recently wrote another book. If you want to talk a bit about that as well.
Yeah, this one's encrypted. It's in Norwegian, so you can't read it. But it's my attempt to sort of give a portrait of Norwegian farmhouse ale at, on an academic level, really going into it. So like this map with the dots, different names for the beer in different places. We have, let's see, that's a bad one. How did people exchange yeast in the Voss area?
Wow.
Each box is a person.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, different methods for keeping the yeast, blah, blah, blah. All everything in detail was really what I'm trying to do. And then also trying to work out more of the history, why things are the way that they are, and that sort of thing. But also, can you see Norwegian regions that are similar to each other? And of course different from each other, and
yeah,
the really obvious conclusion was that Western and Eastern Norway were like two different countries.
Oh, that's fascinating. Just a completely different sort of
yeah,
approach.
But if you see a map of Norway that has terrain on it,
right,
there's like a huge chain of mountains running all the way from the south tip of Norway up to central Norway, and it can many places it's 100-200 kilometers wide.
Yeah.
And nobody lives up there because you can't.
Right, exactly. Yeah, nature doesn't want you to. So
no, basically,
yeah.
And Lars, how far back for our listeners? How far back does your research go? Like, what sort of historical periods do you cover?
Well, my main focus is the period from which I can get detailed descriptions of the brewing, and that in practice that ends up being late 18th century up until today. But I've tried to go as far back as I can, but of course once you go further back than late 18th century, then you're on to guesswork,
right?
And little bits of archaeology, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, no,
So,
that makes sense.
I feel that there is evidence you can find there that helps you understand why things are the way that they are today, why there are regional differences and all of these things. So, but I'm using that more as the background and not as the focus, I guess I should say.
Yeah. No, because I know that there's evidence for hot rock brewing that dates back to like the Viking Age. So I know, archaeologically speaking, so I know that that's a very long-standing technique. So it's really interesting to see that you're sort of tracing it from the 18th century on, and that this is still something that's
there's
very
a continuity.
much in use.
Yeah.
Actually, this thing with the stone evidence is interesting, because there is a particular type of heat-shattered stone that you find in the soil in Norway. You find it in huge thick layers on every farm, and there is actually documentary evidence where somebody asked a farmer 150 years ago, "What is that?" And he says, "Oh, that's brewing stones. It's from when they didn't have metal kettles and they had to use stones." But they only go back to the 7th century.
Only, but
oh yeah, I was gonna say only.
Yeah.
As far as we know, at that point, we should have had 4,600 years of brewing. So So where's the evidence? But it turns out there's another type of stones that go even further back, but they don't go far enough. So we have 3,000 years of probable brewing where we really don't know what was going on.
Yeah, and you probably have some, 19th or even early 20th century archaeological reports where people are taking notes but didn't know what they were looking at. So it may be buried somewhere in an old site report. So
could be. We actually have descriptions of people doing stone brewing in Norway, all of them from a pretty small region in the country, which is quite interesting. But that was published by people who had no real knowledge of beer brewing and also none of archaeology.
Right.
So that is reports that really, the significance of those reports really only was appreciated quite recently.
Yeah, and we've talked about before on the podcast how we need to get Maren Dinley on, because when you have someone who understands both the brewing and the archaeology and can look at those things and say, oh, we recognize what's going on, I think it, like you say, it absolutely can unlock a lot of things that maybe would be obvious if just the right person looked at it. So
yes.
And Lars,
sorry.
No, you're grand. I was just going to say, before we get too far in advance, can you describe to everyone exactly what stone brewing would look like, or a version of it, just so people understand if they're not familiar?
Yeah, that's a very good clarification. So the starting point for this is that metal used to be historically extremely expensive, to the point that not too long ago, anything made of metal was considered to be semi-magical.
Right.
So the reason that a lot of farm doors of these big metal bands is that's magical protection. That's what it's really for, and that's also why people would hang horseshoes over the door. There's nothing to do with good luck; it's to ward off evil. But again, it's because metal is considered magical, and this meant that they didn't have kettles. The price of a kettle was just completely astronomical. Back in the Middle Ages. So then you have to brew without a kettle, and your brewing vessels are of wood. Do you now place them over the fire? Maybe not.
Right. They won't last very long.
But you have to heat the mash. If you don't heat the mash, there isn't going to be any beer. So what do? Well, you take a wooden vessel, fill it with cold water and malts, and you dump hot stones in it, and you heat it up that way. That's stone brewing, basically.
Yeah, and again, I feel like there was this mini trend. Again, trend is the wrong word. Very briefly, where people got very excited about it, but again, I felt like it was at such a remove, if you like, and it was maybe inspired by one or two outliers, if you like, versus kind of this longer standing tradition you're speaking about. So,
well, I think a lot of that was inspired by Michael Jackson's report on Steinbeer. Which has confused people no end, because he visited this brewery in Franconia,
right,
where there's absolutely no evidence that there ever was stone brewing, although of course there must have been.
Right.
And they were brewing with hot stones, and they had heard interview tapes with a commercial stone beer brewer brewing the style of Steinbeer. And they were showing that they were dumping the stones in the wort to boil it. which is
Oh,
not what I
okay.
just described, right?
Right, right.
Somebody who has no kettle, like, why would they boil? There's no point.
Exactly. How did that happen? Yeah.
It's just a waste of effort. But what
Yeah.
about the real problem, making the mash? So, but what happened was Steinbeer came from Austria, a region called Carinthia, bordering Italy. And they really did hear tapes of a real brewery, from a brewery that closed in 1917 in the town of Klagenfurt. But they ignored everything that the tape said. They just did their own thing. Of course, Michael Jackson didn't know this. How could he?
Right, right.
He just showed what they were doing. But I think a lot of people have gone with the Stones go in the wart, because that's what Michael Jackson showed on TV. And
Right, right. Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just slightly lost in translation briefly.
well, I mean, it's he reported everything that he saw accurately. It's just these guys decided they wanted to do it a different way, which, you know, you want to invent your own Franconian Steinbeer tradition. That's fine,
Right.
I guess. It's no real problem. It's only when people go, this is what stone beer was like historically. That's like, no, that's not right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we tried something, or they tried something here in Ireland with the Philocphia beer and the Moore group, which is a absolutely fascinating study, and we will link that in the show notes for everyone that wants to read about it. But they did an amazing, experimental brew, trying to use stones here from a technique that they believe might have existed in Iron Age or older.
Right.
So yeah, we'll link that so you can all, but it is slightly controversial, for sure. So we'll link that in the show notes. But yes, stone brewing is absolutely something that's popped up here in our in Irish native brewing practices as well. Not without controversy though.
Yeah, but like you say, there probably was something of the sort going on in that period for the same reasons. I mean, metal is very expensive, all of these things. So
there was brewing before the Bronze Age. I don't think they had kettles.
Right, exactly. Yeah, they weren't, hauling around exactly, they just didn't have those kettles. But yeah.
Yeah. And I think you brought up something really interesting, Lars, when you introduced the beer that you're drinking. You said it's a raw ale. And can you explain to people what a raw ale is and how this sort of links in with what we're talking about right now?
Yeah, that's a really good one, because a raw ale is just a beer where the wort hasn't been boiled. It's not a style. It's kind of like sour is not a style, because there's many different kinds of sour, right? But raw ale is really, really common in farmhouse ale. I think of the people who are still brewing farmhouse ale today, I would say that more than half don't boil the wort.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
It wasn't that unusual in commercial brewing either, if you go further back. Like Berliner Weisse was originally not boiled. And probably more styles if you go further back. But as Christina is hinting at, the connection here is a lot of these farmhouse brewers, when they get a kettle, they go, "Oh, nice, much easier to mash now," but they don't start boiling.
Right.
They never boiled, and just because they get a kettle, they don't start doing.
Yeah, why start now? Yeah, it's more fuel.
Well, and also it changes. It changes actually the flavor of your beer quite substantially.
No, that makes sense. Yeah.
So it is actually quite a big transition, and it takes time. Yeah, and in fact, one of the challenges for farmhouse brewer is to cool the wort. You usually have 150 liters. It's in a big wooden vessel. Cooling it down is really, really slow business.
Right.
And if you skip the boil, you start from, say, 65 degrees instead of 100.
Right.
Sure.
So the time savings are much larger than they might seem. And of course, when they're boiling, they're doing it by feeding this fire with firewood. It's not like you just turn on the electricity and you wait.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
I was just thinking about that because I know we have up at Canvas Brewery, we have one brewery in Ireland where it is that, fire, like literal wood-fired kettle. And again, it's a proper kettle, but like you say, that takes a long time to get up to the temperatures you would need. So, or I guess maybe need is the wrong word, are used to. But I guess if you have a different technique, you don't have to spend that, well, not just that time, but the expense of the wood.
Yeah.
So Yeah,
Yeah.
there's an economic
Absolutely.
impact as well.
Yeah,
Definitely.
But I think mostly it's a question for them. I think it was mostly that the impulse to boil didn't reach them.
Mhm.
Oh,
So
interesting.
this region where this style of brewing comes from is kind of, there's like a barrier of mountains around the whole area.
Oh, it's
So they
fascinating.
were slow to take up other things as well. For example, when they made cheese, they didn't boil the milk either.
Oh, wow. So there's a whole sort of tradition of just
Yes.
a lot of different things. They just didn't do it. That's interesting. Oh, wow.
But I suppose if you don't need to, why would you? You know, like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
something that I know Martin Cornell has talked about in the UK, and it's something I've found in Ireland as well. Like, why would you spend the money on the fuel, or like you're saying, you know, having to cool it down? It just, without the inclusion of something like hops, where you
Yes.
need, in particular, to get to that, you need that boil.
Yes.
Why would you?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's another good point, because that's one of the things that makes this not taste like a modern beer. That the IBU is so incredibly low. A normal beer has like a backbone of hop bitterness. That's kind of that almost the flavor is built around, and in these beers it's just missing. They don't have it, or if they have bitterness, it's usually from the juniper. So it's a different bitterness flavor. And
Right.
so that's another, hops are a new introduction into beer. And in a lot of farmhouse ales, it hasn't really broken through completely. For them, it's almost like it's something that they're adding to prevent infection. They don't really care about the flavor of it.
That's interesting. So I know you've mentioned the juniper a couple times now. I think we need to, let's talk about juniper. So I know it comes in a couple different places potentially. So I guess maybe, what does it look like? And are we just talking about sort of stirring with, sort of juniper, or like you said, you've got a sort of actual bowl for drinking that's potentially juniper? What is that? How does juniper fit in? Because it's clearly an element throughout. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a long story. Let's start with what it is. It's a conifer tree that usually just grows as a low bush. But if it gets the right conditions, it can shoot up and be 20 meters tall. It's actually of all the trees in the world, this is the species that has the widest distribution of any. It's super adaptable. It grows all the way south to Croatia in Europe, all the way across Siberia, and even across North America. The way that there are two ways that it's used. So one way is that when you filter the wort out of the mash, you put juniper branches in the bottom. And since they spend a long time in hot liquid this way, because the lautering takes a long time when you do it this way. So you get quite a lot of flavor that way. But particularly in Norway, they don't think that is enough. So they don't brew with water. They brew with juniper infusion. So you put juniper branches in the kettle and water, you heat it up, and you make it can be like a pale green tea, or it can be dark brown, depending on how you treat it. Mm-hmm. So this adds bitterness, and you get woody, resinous kinds of flavors. Really, people like to say it's like pine, and yeah, it's a little bit like pine, but I mean, it tastes like juniper is what it tastes like. You just have to get to know the flavor. But what I think a lot of people have missed out on is the fact that of all the spices that have been used in beer, this has to count as number 2 historically. So
fascinating.
There is evidence of juniper use going back to 800 before Christ in Denmark.
It's great.
There would be a lot more evidence if it weren't for the fact that a lot of the analysis of dried up beer from archaeology are done by looking at pollen grains, and juniper pollen is not stable.
Oh, interesting.
So if it was there, you wouldn't find it.
Right. Oh,
so the ones that they found was when they did chemical analysis, and they found substances that are peculiar to juniper, and they're like, oh, okay, it must be juniper. But it has been used, or it has been common to use it in the beer in, let's see, Norway, Sweden, Finland, the three Baltic countries,
Yeah.
in Russia, also in the Steinbeer in Austria. It has been used in Germany, but it wasn't common. Has also been used in Denmark, but it wasn't common. So actually, the places where there's evidence for farmhouse brewing in some detail, and you don't find juniper, are two countries where there isn't a lot of juniper. That's Denmark and the UK.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah. So it's just it's almost purely, it's not there, so they don't use it. So,
Yeah, that's what it seems
yeah.
like. Yeah.
Yeah, because I can remember again when the big sort of salty craze happened in kind of in North America, it was very like they just threw a lot of juniper in everything, and maybe sometimes that worked and sometimes it was a little unbalanced. But I feel like they almost sort of just kind of cribbed some notes, but maybe didn't go all the way into what one of these might have looked like. They just kind of were like, well, we want that flavor. Yeah.
I think at that time it would have been difficult because juniper is a bit of a tricky ingredient. It matters what the plant looks like, and it matters which part of it you use, and then it matters how you treat it.
Yeah.
So like a classic mistake that I made was, just cut some juniper, fairly thick branches, throw them in, boil them, and your beer tastes of cleaning fluid. It's like just borderline drinkable at all. And the mistake was thick branches and too much heat. So I was on Gotland to see the Swedish Gotlandsdrikke just last fall, and with me was a very experienced Sahti brewer and an American brewer, Matt Becker, who is he's brewed a lot of Scandinavian farmhouse ales because he's interested in it. And we see this Swedish brewer take these juniper branches and throw them in and boil them, and we're all three of us are like, "Hey, you what?" And then we're talking like, this doesn't make sense, right? And the beer has to be ruined. And I go, well, why don't we just taste the infusion? And it's fine. There's no problem.
Oh, wow.
Like, yeah, but then how? We still don't know.
Oh, that's funny.
So what I'm getting at is, if you're using hops in your beer, you know how to do it, right? This ingredient is also tricky, and a lot of us don't know how to use it.
Right. Yeah. And I know, Christina, you recently made a historic beer by doing some sort of, if you like, teas infusions to sort of see where that would go. So something along those lines.
Yeah, we did. We brewed. I did a collaboration brew with Closet Brewing Project, or their Closet Brewing just now, in Edinburgh for my book launch, based off of a recipe from 16th century, I think, off the top of my head. And we did different sort of teas just to taste the infusions because we weren't familiar. We used yarrow and bog myrtle and some other things, and we opted not to use the bog myrtle in the final product. But we did that because we tasted the teas and figured out how to scale up and that kind of thing, because again, like yarrow has quite a strong sort of sagey flavor and it can take over. So we kind of did a somewhat similar thing, though I don't think they're quite as perhaps finicky as juniper might be.
Right.
But it was an interesting
those two, by the way, are also farmhouse brewing herbs. They show up in the evidence, especially bog myrtle.
That's kind of why we use them for the historical reasons. And then there were meadowsweet was another one we looked at because there was a burial in North Mains in Scotland from the Bronze Age that had malt. It looked like malt or grain based, possibly alcohol product that had meadowsweet in it. But yeah, so that's interesting that it's also in farmhouse ales. So
meadowsweet is a living tradition.
Yeah,
it's not historical. It's still going
right. Yeah, it's still happening.
There is one brewer in Voss who learned to use it from his father-in-law, but his father-in-law said that you can't actually use it in the beer. What he does is he takes the flowers and he rubs the inside of the fermenter with it, and then he throws them away. And that's enough to flavor the beer. And his father-in-law used to say that if you use more than that, your beer will taste of soap. I mean, that sounds even more fierce in the local dialect.
Oh, I bet. Oh, I love that. So actually, this talk of ingredients too makes me want to sort of get onto the yeast, because I know this is very, very particular, if you like you're not just, well, I'm sure sometimes you are, but I guess you're not just sort of going to White Labs and getting whatever. But and again, I know some people are trying to sort of take yeasts that'll kind of go in this direction, if you like, but tell us about how the yeasts tend to work in kind of in this space.
Yeah. So here in Norway, to take one example, you couldn't really buy yeast until the 1870s.
Right.
That's when they started importing factory-made yeast. It was possible, if you lived in a town, to go to some sort of brewery and get yeast, but for most people, this was impossible.
Right.
You had to maintain your own, because, and the reason you had to is, if you're making sourdough, you can just get the yeast from flour, right? Mm-hmm. Because it doesn't matter what yeast you use, really. It just has to make CO2. But for beer, you have to have really particular yeast to get a good result. So basically you had to maintain it yourself, and everybody did.
Right.
So that's in fact what is on the can.
It's
a yeast strain. So a device that was used for keeping yeast between brews. And
that's amazing. Okay.
I shouldn't mislead you now. These were quite rare.
Okay.
A much simpler version would be, just a wooden log, or even a ring of straw, or in fact, the most common in Norway was pieces of cloth. You just dip them in the yeast, it sinks into it, and you hang them up to dry. So the reason this works is when you add yeast to the beer, it multiplies. You get more yeast than you added. So a brewer always has a surplus of yeast. You always have more than you can use. Mm-hmm. So you can keep going forever. You just take it from the previous beer, put it into the next, and that's it, right? And of course, sometimes it goes wrong. And that's when you go to your neighbor and you get good yeast from them. But it sounds really simple, and it is very simple, but it turns out you have to do it exactly right. If you treat the yeast like a modern brewer does, it's going to go sour within a couple of brews, for the most part. And the other thing about this is that the way that people were treating these yeasts, and now I'm talking about farmhouse brewing from, Orkney Islands to the Ural Mountains, northern Norway down to, who knows, somewhere in Germany at least. They were all treating them in ways that are different from how modern yeast was used. So fermentation was much hotter at body temperature, which is insane for a modern brewer. Very, very fast fermentations. Like you would harvest the yeast like the day after or 2 days after. And the fact that not always, but a lot of the time they would dry the yeast, and most modern beer yeast can't be dried; it dies.
Right.
So
sure, yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. So it really looks like all of these brewers, and farmhouse brewers in Suffolk or Orkney Islands or Wales, Denmark, Poland, wherever you like. It looks like all of them used a type of yeast that's different from modern yeast, or types of yeast. I mean, it could be many types, who knows?
Wow, so there's a big project out there for someone who was like a yeast sort of chemist to go and do that work potentially. So PhD for someone.
We're doing that work. So
great.
Awesome.
Yes, my next meeting with microbiologists is Friday morning.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, we love to hear it.
That's really exciting.
Yes, yeah. So there is some very good work coming with I mean, it's their research, so I can't really say what they found until they published it. But the yeast that was used in this, which is called kveik, is yeast that people have been reusing in Western Norway for many centuries. They still have it, and when you test it genetically, it's like, yes, it's clearly different from modern beer yeast. And it has exactly the properties that when if you look at archive documentation of how they were using it, turns out, yes, it can be dried. Yes, it likes hot temperatures, and yes, it's super fast at fermenting.
So I guess maybe the obvious question is when we see like a modern, say a modern craft beer from essentially anywhere where where they're using what they're calling a kvike yeast, are they the same, or I guess where? I guess, is there a flavor profile that maybe they're insinuating, if you like, when we see that, or is it something almost completely different that they're using?
No, they are actually using real kvike yeast. So
okay.
When I started collecting these yeasts, I was a little bit desperate because the brewing didn't seem like it was very healthy, and if they didn't keep brewing, the yeast was going to die.
Right.
So I thought, I have to get people to use this. So I sent it to commercial yeast labs where I could, basically, to get them to commercialize it, so they would be and it's really become quite popular. I mean, it's being produced over much of the world, and it's if you go onto Untapped and you type kvike, there's like 4,000 hits.
Yeah, and I guess that's why I'm slightly almost like dubious is the wrong word. I'm like, but is it the same, or are they just kind of hopping on a bandwagon?
Well, there are differences. So if you go to a farmhouse brewer and you get dried chips,
yeah,
in there will be a large number of different strains.
Sure. Okay.
And the number that you find depends a little bit on which brewer you go to, but also how good your methods for finding strains are. Right. So some labs will say, yeah, there's 2 strains in here, and then Carlsberg will look at the same thing and they'll say, well, we found 45.
Right.
This isn't really something that you can count with any. It's like counting different colors. Are these 2 colors the same or different? Yeah, well, depends, right? Yeah. But when you buy commercial yeast, you get 1 strain.
Right.
They're using the full set, and you can not with all of these, but with some of them you can definitely taste the difference. And you can also see differences in behavior. Quite a few yeast strains have the property that if you use them alone, when the beer is finished fermenting, they don't clump up and drop out. They need other strains that are different from themselves to do this. And I'm sure there's similar things happening during fermentation as well, but we just don't know about it because nobody studied it.
Right.
Yeah. So there are differences, but when they say they're using kvike, it's true. They are.
It's fascinating. And I had no idea there are so many different varieties, but I guess there are so many different types of every yeast these days, I suppose. So.
Well, that's that. If you look at, how many different modern commercial beer yeasts there are, there's not a huge number. Of lager yeast, there's a very small number.
Yeah. Oh, that's true. Yeah.
And of commercial yeast, I think the big Galone et al. Study in 2016 had something like 150 commercial yeast strains. But the Belgians who looked at kvike analyzed, I think, 28 cultures, wow. And they have 280 different strains.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
Yeah, and they still haven't looked at all the cultures, right? So, sure. Yeah. And I wanted to say that there was a Norwegian brewery that took kvike from one brewer, and they worked with somebody who broke it into strains, and then they skipped the ones that there were the most of, and they picked 3 of the rare ones, and they brewed the same beer with those 3 different strains, and they were really different from each other. There was no difficulty telling them apart.
That's so cool.
Super interesting project. It's a real shame that they just made it once and now it's gone.
Oh yeah, no, that would be so interesting to repeat and maybe do it under different conditions and see what you got. But
fascinating. That is so cool.
Yeah, and Christina, you may want to jump in on this one as well. But so back to kind of the wooden bowl and so on. I'm thinking kind of the material culture, if you like, around this kind of brewing, because there's obviously both the brewing and kind of the serving of it, if you like. So I have many questions, and I'm sure Christina does as well. So
yeah, that is an absolutely gigantic subject if you want to go into the culture around it, because it touches almost every side of peasant culture.
Yeah, well, even just something like you said, this yeast strainer, which might not be very common, but just the fact that something like that exists is fascinating, and you know, says
Yeah,
something
so
about that. So yeah.
let me show you some pictures. This is a farmhouse drinking vessel.
Oh, wow. Christina, do you want to describe that to the folks at home? That's amazing. You're like lost for words.
No, she's muted.
Sorry, I'm on mute because I'm so sorry. I'm on mute because my dog is barking. It's a bird. Is it a duck?
Looks like a duck,
and
yeah.
and it's really colorful. It's yellow and green and red feathers. And like the bowl part is like the back of the duck with its little tail feathers. It's so cute.
That's amazing.
It's very cool.
This is a book of yeah, it's all different.
Oh, the chicken!
Wow.
The chicken one.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so there's, you know, you get the idea.
Wow.
And this is one type of Norwegian beer bowl, and I could show you like 10 more books.
Wow, I feel okay. I feel like there's a purchase in my future. I feel like, you know, my not very good Danish is good enough to at least read that Norwegian, maybe. So yeah,
probably, yeah. When you read it, Danish and Norwegian is almost the same.
Yeah, we'll get there, because I guess it's just like beer horn, if you like, more or less, or beer vessel, more or less, if you translate it into English. But wow, those are amazing. And I think, you know, again, for anyone who like me, you know, went and did a lot of archaeology grad school and saw a lot of sort of libation chambers and drinking vessels, like, okay, those are fine. Like your Greek ones are fine. Those are cool though. Like that's like next level stuff. It's so colorful, and but I love the animal shapes. That's so interesting, and so many birds. That's
this book is called Beer Hens. That's
it's
the name
Beer
of this
Hens.
type of bowl.
Oh wow. So that's a very specific.
If I get a different book, you get the ones that have horse head handles.
Oh my gosh. Okay, it's like I'm here for that.
Yeah, we can carry on.
Wow. Typologies.
Yeah. Are there modern artisans? Are there people who make these now? Like, say, if I was like, I want to buy one of these, are there people making them now?
Yeah, it's if you want to buy, typically it's easier to find an antique one. So the people who make them now mostly make them for themselves.
Okay.
You know, the last time I was in Voss, they served us their own hornbrew, you know, in Skänge, and one of the guys, he'd made the one that he was serving us in. Actually, he'd made 3 different ones, and there is it's called Cultural Academy of Western Norway. They actually do courses in carving these, like every 2 or 3 years.
Oh, that's amazing! Oh wow. Okay. Christina is making this amazing face. People at home,
sign me up. I'm going. 3 years from now, that's where I will be. If that's when they're having it, I'm going. That is so cool.
Oh my gosh. So, yeah, we clearly need to do a deep dive on those separately, but just tell us about your wooden bowl, and because again, it's just beautiful. And
you mean this one?
Yeah, the one you're using now. And I know you said you have an even more sort of historic one, but
I have this one is made commercially for the same brewery that made the beer.
Oh, okay, very good.
The reason they did that is this is what you're meant to drink the beer from. It's made to be drunk from these.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, and it's also, you know, if you think of wine ceremony when you're serving the wine, right? It's a really important part of driving home the point that this is not just liquid, right? It's not water we're drinking. And if you want people to, you know, sit up and take notice of your beer, make them drink it from this.
Oh, here. Yeah. Folks, get your drinking bowls. We're here for it.
But the one I have in the other room, according to my dad, it was probably painted by my grandma.
Oh wow.
So cool.
It was probably made in a workshop in the town where he grew up, and she probably then bought it without paint, but because she was into the there's a particular style of decoration that's called rosemaling, rose paint. It's really twisted floral shapes that sort of tie into each other. And this is painted in that style, which was very common. Yeah, so you could do typologies of these shapes that they draw, and then there's poems around the rims of the bowls, and so that's
Oh
a
my
whole
goodness.
literary genre of its own. So, I mean, I have a whole library of books just on bowls.
So cool.
Oh my gosh, here for it. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Those are really cool.
That's amazing. And again, I feel like we could dive into that and talk about just that for hours, but I know we're
Yes.
coming up on time, because we want to make sure you can get to bed and everyone else as well. But are there any big myths you feel like we should be busting about Norwegian farmhouse ales? What's the one thing people think they know that's just wrong?
Well, we did a few on the way, and I think actually the thing I would like to draw attention to, and that I try to do in this book, is, you know, this photo is from Russia. There's farmhouse brewing going on in Russia, in Belarus. It's not just Norway, right? The Baltics, Finland. There's people still brewing in Denmark and other places that you would be surprised to hear about.
Yeah, so like you said, it's a living tradition. It's not something that's,
it's not historical, or, you know, this beer is historical in the same way as porter is historical.
That's a great way
historical
of saying,
comes from the porter comes from the 18th century. Who knows when this comes from, but, you know, they're equally historical as far as I'm concerned. I really dislike that the BJCP put the farmhouse styles under historical.
Yeah, well, I think we all have various issues with how these things get sort of categorized and changed.
But it's also the focus on Norway. I mean, I am Norwegian. I tend to talk about the Norwegian beers the most because it's closest to me and I know the most about them.
Yeah.
But the other ones are equally interesting. You know, go to Lithuania, go to Estonia. Don't go to Russia.
Maybe not right now. Yeah. Yeah, I'll have to see if I can find some when we go to Denmark and Sweden for Eurovision. I'm sorry, we have to mention it every episode because, you know, it's our fault, but, you know, so we'll see what we can seek out.
You won't find any in Denmark, unfortunately, unless you do 1.5 hour drive out of Copenhagen. You won't get any. Yeah,
no, even going to Odense a lot, it was all just your typical, you know, Carlsberg and friends out there. But
it's the brewing, and I'm actually right now trying to find brewers to visit in March. And you know, first person I look up, when I Google his name, I find the person responsible for his estate. So he's dead.
Oh no!
I got his phone number 5 years ago, and Googling a little further, I found the death notice. He died in January this year.
Oh no!
So sad.
And then through another person, I got hold of two ladies who know brewing. They're 90 and 94 years old.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
Yeah. So, and then we found one guy who's not old, so we're gonna visit him as well.
Oh, well, best of luck in that. So, I don't know, Christina, any closing questions before we?
Yes.
Go for it.
Not question, but I do want to mention that Lars and myself and actually Moss from the brewery in Tipperary.
From Canvas, yes.
There we go. Sorry, Moss. We're on the Bjor podcast a couple years ago, wasn't it, Lars? Talking about Lithuanian farmhouse brewing. You were talking about it. I was asking questions. It was on the Bjor Fest podcast. And I was asking questions, and you all were experts. And it was yourself and Simonas.
Oh, now I couldn't recognize what you were saying, but yes.
Yes.
Yes, the Irish one.
Yes, it was the Bjor Fest. Right. So we'll link that in the show notes, friends, as well, because if you want to learn about farmhouse brewing in a different place in Lithuania, which Lars is also an expert in, I do highly recommend that podcast. It was fascinating. I knew very little about Lithuanian farmhouse brewing, so I was just happy to be there and ask questions, and just learned so much from everyone, and fell in love with the brewing and everything I learned. Absolutely, we'll link that. Highly recommended. And they had Simonas from the Dundalis brewery on, which was absolutely it was just incredible. So we will link that as well. You all can learn a bit about Lithuanian brewing as well.
Oh, so fantastic. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Lars. I think with that, I'm going to end on, I have learned that there are ale hens and that's
yes.
a thing that exists in the world. And
yep.
I need to find out more about them, but I think we've only scratched the surface. We could clearly dive into each of these things, on a much deeper level. So we might have to do a part 2 sometime. But for now, Lars, thank you so much. Christina, thank you as always. And folks at home, thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Thank you.